Well, joining us now from Washington to talk more about this is Erik Stegman. He is the Executive Director of the Center for Native American Youth. Thank you for being with us. So I guess my first question then is how did the situation become so desperate for people in the indigenous communities there? I mean, how was this allowed to get this bad?
Thank you for having me on, and our thoughts and prayers are definitely with Attawapiskat today. Unfortunately, we have very similar issues here south of the border for tribes in our country. Youth here in our country on reservations are committing suicide at 2.5 times the national rate. And it's been an epidemic here, and unfortunately many of the statistics are very similar to what we see in First Nations. I think the story that you just aired showed a lot of the community anger and the justifiable anger at what has been going on for a long time. And I very much agree that it's a very sad state of affairs when a community has to call for a declaration of an emergency in order to get mental health counselors as the front line of defense. But what they're really dealing with are structural problems. These youth are facing high rates of violence. They're facing some of the highest rates of poverty in the country. And as you heard, the federal budget for generations has not met the needs of those communities in the North.
Well, I want to pose that question then that we heard from the Canadian Member of Parliament in that report there. What is it going to take, in your view, to end this desperate cycle? And as you say, these are similar problems in Canada and in the U.S.
Well, this cycle goes back for generations for our people on both sides of the border. Unfortunately, the federal governments of the United States and Canada have been working for generations under a policy of assimilation. My great-grandfather went to a boarding school in Saskatchewan near the Carry the Kettle First Nation, and that was part of a national program for many generations to forcibly remove children from their homes in their native communities to try to assimilate them with white culture. They were stripped of their language and culture in these schools. They were often beaten and treated terribly. And we had the same thing going on here in the U.S. And that created a high level of historical trauma that our communities still face today. In order to turn that legacy around, we really need to approach these with holistic solutions, because our youth in communities here in the U.S. and in First Nations in Canada are dealing with a complete lack of support in school, where they've got the lowest graduation rates in the country, at least here, and very much the same up in Canada, and also in other areas that they're in. One study recently here in the U.S. found that our Native youth are actually experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder at the same levels of veterans returning from wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that's the level of violence and trauma that these youth are still dealing with. They've got nowhere to go. They feel a lack of hope. And this is why you see these high numbers happening here and up north in the First Nations.
And in Canada, we have a new Prime Minister, a relatively new Prime Minister there. He was elected on this kind of wave of optimism. How much hope, if any, do you have in his government being able to tackle this?
I have a lot of hope, and I was really encouraged by Prime Minister Trudeau's commitments early on with the Assembly of First Nations and First Nations across the country to really try to start turning around some of these large structural problems. But it's going to take a lot of resources, and it's going to take a national commitment. And I hope that he'll look south of the border here. President Obama 2 years ago visited with youth at the Standing Rock Reservation and was very moved by a lot of the same challenges, and started a new initiative here called the Generation Indigenous Initiative to try to look across the federal government and find ways that we can leverage all of our existing resources to better support Native youth. But that's just one step. We need a serious commitment. I think that's why you're seeing those debates go on in Parliament.
Appreciate your thoughts on this, Erik Stegman. Thanks for being with us.